everyone. This is the topic overview lecture. I'm going to try to keep all these to 15 minutes or less, as I said, but I wanted to introduce you to our topic and show you what are the key points of debate for our two resolutions. I chose the topic race and policing because this is a class about contemporary issues, and that seems to be one of the hot button issues of the moment. So on to our resolutions. The first resolution: resolved, there is clear evidence of racism in U.S. policing. Now, whenever you have a resolution to debate, your first argument concept for this class is called stasis. That is the point of contention. That is where the argument comes together, collides, and on which the debate turns. So for our resolution, there is clear evidence of racism in U.S. policing. There are three main points of contention. The affirmative needs to win all of these points of contention in order to prove their case. And if the negative denies any of these points of contention, then they win the debate. The first is the phrase clear evidence. And for this, the affirmative must show that there is a pattern of racism, that there's consistent and conclusive evidence that there are racial inequalities when it comes to policing. There's a lot of different types of racial inequality the affirmative might point to. Things like racial profiling, where police target people of color, disproportionate arrests, disproportionate killings, abuse and harassment of minority populations, as well as predictive policing algorithms. There's some evidence that the algorithms police use to determine where to send their troops end up sending police forces to minority neighborhoods more often. Now, that's not all of the evidence that you might point to, but you can, there's other evidence, for instance, about the culture of policing, about implicit bias amongst police. But whatever evidence you choose, this evidence must be clear, and that means it must be conclusive and must show a pattern. The negative can say, that white people are killed almost at the same rate, or that arrests are almost at the same rate, and if they prove those points, then the evidence is no longer clear. Racism is the second point of contention. What do we mean by racism? Is racism just explicit prejudice, like something like using the N-word? Or, as I mentioned, is it something like subconscious or implicit bias? Implicit bias is the idea that kind of subconsciously we have biases against people of color. In fact, there's an implicit bias test online done by Harvard University that you can take that measures how much implicit bias you have. And it shows that almost everyone is implicitly biased. Even people of color tend to see black people as criminals more than white people, for instance. So as the affirmative, it's important for you to define what type of racism we're talking about: explicit prejudice, implicit bias, or what's called institutional racism. That is, that the practices and the culture of the institution reinforce racial inequality. Even if the officers aren't explicitly biased, if they're doing things like policing minority neighborhoods more frequently, arresting people of color more frequently, racial profiling, then that can be evidence of explicit racism, or of institutional racism, excuse me. Now, the negative can try to offer a counter definition and say, for instance, that racism is only explicit prejudice, and that there are only a few cops who are explicitly prejudiced, and therefore the affirmative has not proven that there is racism. So the second area of debate in this topic is going to be about the definition of racism, what counts as racism, when we're talking about clear evidence. The third point of stasis is about policing, and I chose the word policing instead of police carefully, so that the negative can argue that it's just a few bad apples. Yes, there's some racist police, but policing as a practice and a culture is not racist. Maybe there are policies in place in police departments that prevent, uh, you know, racist practices. So you can make that argument. Or you can say that most cops are not racist, and therefore U.S. policing in general is not racist. The affirmative will want to say no, that the culture of policing and the practices such as racial profiling and predictive policing algorithms and policing minority neighborhoods more frequently are actually themselves racist. And it extends more to the institution and the culture of policing than to just a few bad apples. So in sum, for this resolution, we'll debate the evidence of racism in policing, how widespread that is, if it's part of the institution and the culture, and what the definition of racism is, and whether there's evidence that fits that definition. Our second resolution that we'll debate for 2 debates is a policy resolution, and this is one that calls for a change in policy, so the points of stasis will be a little bit different. Here, our resolution is resolved: cities should implement a policy of defunding the police. So the affirmative will offer and defend a policy of defunding the police, and the negative will argue against those policies. So the points of stasis here can be summarized in, again, 3 main ones. First, the harm. What is the problem with policing? This will be very similar to our first debate topic. Again, you'll probably focus on the violence and the racism in policing as your main problem. But there's also some other arguments or other harms that are occurring right now. One of the arguments in favor of defunding the police says that police right now are called on to do many tasks that they're not really equipped to do. So for instance, many police calls have to do with people that are having mental health issues. And police aren't trained in mental health capacities. So one of the problems you could talk about here as well is the idea that police are handling problems that they're not trained to handle, and they're doing a poor job at handling those kinds of problems. The second thing is called the plan. This resolution allows you to define what your policy of defunding the police is. You could do anything from abolish the police to, more commonly and more likely, decreasing police funding and spending that money on social workers and mental health counselors and poverty programs instead. You will have to define what your plan is as the affirmative, and then defend why that plan solves the harm that you've outlined. So why will hiring more mental health counselors solve the problem of the police dealing poorly with mental health problems? Or why will decreasing police funding decrease the problem of targeting and arresting people of color more likely? So, it's problem solution, basically. Here's the problem, our harm, here's our proposed solution, and here's how that policy will solve the problem. As a negative, again, you can win and argue that there's not that problem, that problem doesn't exist, or that policy would not solve the problem. That, for instance, anti-poverty programs are ineffective, or that mental health counseling would not be effective in solving the problem. The negative can also argue broader negative points or positions. Um, some of those are called disadvantages. Disadvantages are what goes wrong when this policy is implemented. Probably the most common of these would be a crime disadvantage. You would argue that increased police funding has reduced crime, and getting rid of police funding will increase crime. So this doesn't challenge the affirmative arguments directly, but says that there's some kind of negative effect or side effect of the policy that they've proposed, like a crime disadvantage. The negative can also argue what's called a counter plan. That is, instead of defunding the police, we should do something else to take care of the problem. There are many, for instance, reform to policing that people have advocated, implicit bias training for the police, reforms that have national databases for police who behave poorly and gets them fired, reforms that increase community-based policing or that increase civilian review boards over police. So in other words, instead of cutting the funding and doing what the affirmative says, the negative can say, we will leave the funding in place, but do these reforms, and that will solve the problem that the affirmative outlines just as well, if not better, while avoiding the disadvantage of crime that comes from cutting the police force and the police funding. So those are not all of the arguments that are out there. There's lots of different evidence of racism in policing. There's lots of different potential policy proposals. You're going to be doing the research to find these arguments, but these are just a coverage of what you have to prove in the debate to win, right? The affirmative has to prove each of those points of contention in order to win. In the policy debate, the affirmative must prove that there's a harm and that they have the right solution. The negative can deny or negate any of those points of contention and win the debate. If they prove there's no harm, they win the debate. If they prove the solution doesn't work, they win the debate. If they prove that there's a better solution or that the solution would cause excuse me, worse problems like crime, they win the debate. So next class we will talk about doing the research and posting our briefs. You'll notice excuse me my mouth is dry. You'll notice that we have no textbook readings for this class. I'm going to teach you argument theory without using a textbook and how to rebut and make solid arguments. But the arguments themselves, you're going to find the research for to back up and support. And next class, we'll talk about that assignment and we'll begin doing those in the following week. I hope you have a good week. Please email me with any questions and take care.